Immigration in the United States. It's a topic that's pretty much always in the headlines. But behind all that noise, there's a number, a really big one, that's often misunderstood. So in this explainer, we're going to dive into the data, go beyond the headlines, and build a clear, factual picture of what's really going on.
Our story really kicks off with that one huge number, 14 million. In 2023, that was the estimated number of unauthorized immigrants living in the U.S., which is an all-time high. And to give you some perspective, that's a jump of 3.5 million people in just 2 years. I mean, that is the biggest jump we have ever seen on record.
But you know, that big number, 14 million, it doesn't really tell the whole story. It's so easy to just think of it as one single group of people. But the reality, it's so much more complicated. We're talking about millions of individuals with completely different circumstances, legal situations, and of course, personal stories.
All right, so let's actually peel back the layers on that 14 million and see what that number is truly made of.
Okay, first things first, we got to be clear on what we mean by unauthorized immigrant for this analysis. It's a pretty broad term. It's not just people who cross the border without permission. It also includes folks who came here totally legally on a visa and then, for whatever reason, stayed past its expiration date. And here's the part that might surprise you. It also includes millions of people who actually have some form of temporary legal status, but no clear path to staying here permanently.
And this is where the picture starts to get really interesting. Of those 14 million people, a whopping 6 million of them, that's more than 40%, are actually living in the U.S. with some kind of temporary shield from deportation. This is a huge and honestly an often missed part of the whole conversation.
So where do these protections come from? Well, it's a whole mix of different programs. You've got the biggest chunk, 2.6 million people, who are asylum applicants waiting for their cases to be heard. Then there's 1 million people who were released by Border Patrol with orders to appear in court. Plus, you have hundreds of thousands in well-known programs like DACA for childhood arrivals or TPS for people from countries going through a major crisis. Each and every one of these categories is a unique legal situation.
Okay, so that tells us a bit about the legal side of things, but who are these people? Where are they coming from? Well, the data shows the profile of this population has shifted and pretty dramatically.
You know, for the longest time, whenever people talked about unauthorized immigration, the conversation was almost always about Mexico. But that picture has totally changed. In 2023, almost 10 million unauthorized immigrants were from countries other than Mexico. The population has become way more global.
Now, Mexico is still number one on the list of single countries, for sure, but its piece of the pie has actually shrunk to a record low of just 30%. Right behind Mexico, you've got Guatemala and El Salvador, then Honduras, and get this, India comes in at number 5, which might surprise some people.
And this brings up another really fascinating split in the population. It's almost like two different groups living side by side. You have this massive wave of recent arrivals, over 4 million people who've been here for less than 5 years, and then you have an equally large group of over 4 million people who are long settled, who've been living in the U.S. for almost 2 decades or even longer.
Okay, so that naturally leads to the next big questions, right? How are people getting here, and why are they coming in the first place? The data gives us a pretty clear window into both.
So there are really 2 main ways people become part of this population, and legally they're worlds apart. Crossing the border without getting authorization is a federal criminal offense. But on the other hand, coming in legally with a visa and then not leaving when it expires, that's treated as a civil violation.
And here's something that might just flip what you think you know. For well over a decade now, since 2007, the main driver of growth in this population hasn't been from people crossing the border without authorization. It's actually been from visa overstays.
So, why do people make these incredibly tough journeys? Well, the reasons are, of course, super complex and deeply personal, but researchers point to a few key push factors. People are often fleeing violence and just trying to find some security. They're looking for a way to survive economically. They're escaping political corruption and governments that have failed them, and sometimes it's as simple as wanting to be reunited with family who are already here.
So all of this naturally brings us to the big debate. What's the impact here in the United States, and what are the arguments that surround it?
Let's kick things off with the economy. In 2023, we're talking about nearly 10 million, 9.7 million unauthorized immigrants in the U.S. workforce. To put that in perspective, that's 5.6% of every single person working in the country, a new record high.
And they really are working in every part of the economy, but you see them most concentrated in a few key areas. Unauthorized immigrants make up 15% of the construction workforce, 14% in agriculture, and 8% of the jobs in leisure and hospitality.
When it comes to the economy, you hear two very different stories. On one hand, you have public concerns, which often focus on potential strains on social services. But on the other hand, you have multiple economic studies that have found that this population actually grows the overall size of the economy, contributes more in taxes than they use in benefits, and even helps lower prices for all consumers.
And you see a really similar gap when the conversation turns to crime. A common concern is that immigration could lead to higher crime rates. However, when you look at the data, and this is based on extensive research and even FBI data, it is consistently found that undocumented immigrants are actually less likely to commit crimes than native-born U.S. citizens.
But here's the thing. This whole picture we'd been painting, it's not a fixed photo. It's more like a movie, and the plot is already changing, almost as we speak, according to the very latest data.
So that record growth from 2023, it looked like it was continuing right into early 2024. But then, something changed. Preliminary data shows that growth slowed way down by the middle of the year. And the projections suggest that as we move into early 2025, the population has likely already started to decline.
And this isn't just happening by accident. It's a direct result of some really big policy changes. We're talking about new rules for asylum at the border, pauses in certain parole programs, and an increase in deportations, policies put in place by both the Biden and Trump administrations that are the main drivers of this turnaround.
So all of this leaves us with this huge question mark, right? The data tells a story of incredibly rapid change, a story driven by what's happening around the world, and by policy decisions made right here. What we've looked at today is really just a snapshot in time. The full story is complex, it's constantly changing, and it is far from over.